Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. I know there are a couple of folks out there who don't always love the punny intros that I do for these videos, and I want everyone to know that I am going to make a change, and I'm starting with the man in the Miirym.
So Miirym Sentinel Wyrm is bonkers, right? Like, I can't be the only one who thinks this. 6 mana 6/6 flying ward 2 that doubles up your dragons, even the legendary ones, by making the tokens non-legendary. Yeah, there's no wonder that this is so popular. When I first started planning this video, Miirym had like maybe 1,800 decks to its name, and now it has over 3,300. Miirym Sentinel Wyrm is the truth. We're hopping right to it. We're going to grab Miirym's average deck from the average deck feature and import it to the Architect deck building website. As always in this series, any swaps that we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the list. Dragons as a tribe tend to be one of the top 5, if not top 3 most popular tribes in EDH. Currently, dragons are definitely on an upswing after the influx of new amazing toys they got from Baldur's Gate. And with a brand new dragon like Miirym offering a brand new take on dragons, it's really no wonder that they are swinging up in popularity right now. For a long time, we've been used to the Dragon as one of the de facto go-to dragon commanders, but Miirym is really giving all of those other dragons a run for their money. Any one of these creatures would be amazing to have multiple copies of. And frankly, the ability to copy legendary creatures is just really astounding. I really can't get over that fact. It makes all of these dragons a lot more punchy. A lot of the support pieces here will look very familiar to anyone who is already playing a Teamer deck or already playing a Dragon deck, but that doesn't make them any less special. I mean, it's really fantastic to see these Dragon tutors, to see all of these ramp sources, to see these haste enablers, and all of the card draw here. Dragon players definitely know what they're doing and know the support system that these enormous beasts need to have a successful EDH deck. Before we get into any swaps and upgrades, let's of course go over a few key cards that stand out from amongst this list. And actually, this is just my way of saying that I really want to celebrate these dragons. Look how cool these are. Can you imagine having 2 Balefire dragons? Can you imagine having 2 Clouts? Can you imagine having double the amount of Lathliss making double the amount of dragon tokens? There are brand new dragons showing up from Baldur's Gate, and there are brand new mana sources helping ramp out all of these amazing beasts as well. I definitely think it's important to highlight some of our favorite enchantments here too. Dragon Tempest is, dare I say, one of the best cards in the entire deck because the haste is phenomenal and the damage really racks up. In fact, those dragons that deal damage when we get more dragons in play are probably our go-tos whenever we, for example, tutor a dragon straight to hand. Those have got to be our MVPs. So let's get to it. There are 2 things that I'd like to do for this deck list. First will be a simple Draconic Shift, but then I would also like to get a budget version of this deck as well, because some of these dragons can be pretty expensive, but Miirym doesn't need a whole bunch of money behind her to make a very impactful EDH deck. Let's get right into it with part 1. To be honest, there aren't actually that many swaps that I want to make to this average list. The original starting deck is in a really good spot. I think in this first section, I'll only end up making like 5, maybe 6 swaps total. I really like where this deck is at, but there is one very common problem that happens to be an issue with it. Basically, I want to make sure that if our dragon's trying to hoard a bunch of resources, that it actually has the resources to do that. The main thing that I want to address with this list is actually its land count. The mana base here needs a little bit of work. I'm sorry, 33 lands is not going to do it for a deck that contains this many 6 drops and 7 drops and 8 drops. Notably, we do have like 16 or 17 mana acceleration cards in the main deck, but those can't do all of the work on their own. We definitely need to be able to hit our land drops consistently if we ever want to have any hope of casting a 6 mana commander on time. As a result, I'm going to mess with the mana base a little bit. First, I want to add a Mosswort Bridge and an Unclaimed Territory. These are both amazing lands if you're playing Tribal, and Mosswort Bridge can give you free stuff as long as you play a lot of big creatures. And, well, the last time I checked, the strategy of this deck was to play a lot of big creatures, so this should be a pretty easy target to hit. In addition to this, I'd also like to throw in the card Glasspool Mimic. This card was actually brought to our attention by one of our patrons as a really awesome pick for Miirym decks. It can be a land when you need it, but it can also be a copy of a creature that you control when you need it. And I'll get to more of my thoughts on copies at the end of the video, but playing a clone of one of the non-legendary tokens that Miirym makes, and then also getting an additional copy of that because of Miirym's effect on the Glasspool Mimic, yeah, all of that just sounds really, really awesome, and it adds a little bit more mana consistency to our deck as well. A+. The mana woes aren't quite over, though. There are some new dragon orbs from Baldur's Gate that are showing up in Miirym's average deck, but I don't really vibe with all of them. I think the Jade orb is phenomenal. Hexproof will really save your bacon. But the blue orb doing some scry and the red orb giving some haste, those don't feel like effects that we're actually very hungry for. And since we're adding in copies, I would actually like to swipe these out of the deck and instead add in the card Cursed Mirror. This is a mana source, and once again, it's another copy effect. This can be amazing mana production, and it can also give us bonus dragons because of Miirym seeing a non-token Cursed Mirror dragon entering play, and then giving us another dragon to tag along with it. When a 3-mana mana rock can also come with a free dragon attached to it, that just seems a lot better to me than a couple of random orbs. However, we do have to look pretty critically at the actual creatures themselves. Not every dragon that is showing up in this average deck is really pulling its weight. For example, I actually don't really like Imrith all that much. It is kind of nice to have multiple copies of it, I suppose. I mean, they will help us draw some extra cards, but that doesn't feel like a thing that we need as much help with here. Each of these will basically only ever let us draw one single card if they happen to hit something, and that's not the type of consistency that I'm really here for. I'll also throw a little bit of shade at Minion of the Mighty. Basically, I just don't think that this is an effect that we're in very dire need of, especially because it has to wait a turn to attack, and it has to attack with something else, most likely our commander, but all of that takes a little bit of extra time. And why bother taking extra time when we could be using this card slot to play other, more awesome dragons? It's a cool and flavorful effect, but I think it is just a teensy bit of a distraction, and it's really no surprise to me that, according to the data on EDHREC, as dragon decks upgrade themselves more and more, Minion of the Mighty tends to fall out of the more tuned dragon deck lists. And finally, Furkrag, Cunning Instigator, is cunning indeed, but he seems a little, lackluster, I guess, here. Believe me, I've got a go deck. I really love messing with opponents' combats in this way, and the card draw is certainly welcome, but the card draw is also conditional, and as dragons go, he's a little bit tiny. Duplicating his effect is certainly rad, but he's just not my favorite of the dragons that we could be playing. And frankly, we have a lot of dragons here already, and I want to make room for some really spicy enchantments. So sorry Furkrag, but I look forward to seeing you in some other decks instead. And actually, you know what, before I get to those enchantments that I want to add, I think it's actually important for us to take a look at the support cards that are in this deck and see if there's anything to cut from among those, especially within the enchantment section. Like this here Rhythm of the Wilds, for example, that only works on non-token creatures, and our commander makes a lot of tokens. We already have a lot of other haste enablers in this deck, so I don't think this one is all that necessary, especially since it's like $6 or something like that. I think it's safe to say peace out to this card and add in some other spicy stuff instead. For example, if you're sad that I cut the Minion of the Mighty earlier, don't worry, we've got another card to help cheat dragons into play instead. Lurking Predators is just one of my favorite cards to ever play in any deck that contains this many huge creatures. Whenever an opponent basically does anything, we have the chance to flip amazing creatures into play, and our commander is an enter the battlefield trigger, not a cast trigger, so we'll still get the effects from Miirym whenever we cheat a dragon into play like this. Lurking Predators is fantastic and definitely worth the price for a deck like this. And last but not least is a definitely underrated card for any dragon deck out there, Bower Passage. Creatures with flying can't block the creatures that we control? Interesting. All of our creatures have flying, and flying creatures can't block them. This makes our stuff basically unblockable, and it's one of the most subtly powerful cards that you can play in a deck that contains this many flying creatures. And that ought to do it. But before we move on to section 2, here are some honorable mentions for cards to include in this deck if you're going even more luxurious with your dragon horde.
Cards like the Great Henge will be really easy to cast and draw a bunch of extra cards, and the classics like Rhystic Study and even Deflecting Swat will help out a lot too, to give more card advantage and to protect your creatures. And really, I think one of the most important places to upgrade for this deck to improve its consistency is, again, its mana base. Cards like Boseiju and Ancient Tomb will help give these dragons a lot of extra support and make the deck a lot more consistent overall. Because after all, once the dragons are in play, we're gonna be golden, but it's getting them into play in the first place that needs the most help. So if you're going to splurge on this deck, make sure your mana is in check. Short, sweet, and to the point, this deck looks absolutely rad. I'm not usually a teamer player, but Miirym definitely has a lot going for it. You can find a link to this version of the deck in the description below, but we're not done yet. Now it's time for us to take this list and make it a lot more budget conscious. Dragons are extremely popular, and high demand often means a high price tag. Where there are a lot of other videos that I've been able to do where we can cut like 3 or 4, maybe 5 cards, and that cuts the entire price of the deck in half. In this video, we will have to be a lot more judicious about our cuts. There are a lot more high-priced cards in a dragon deck than in a lot of the other videos that we've done. But that's no worry, because even though there are a lot of very high-priced dragons, there are a lot of very low-priced dragons that still pack a huge wallop. To start off, we're going to cut basically any card that's over roughly like $10. And that means that we're cutting out actually quite a lot of cards here. From Old Gnawbone to Terror of the Peaks, from Goldspan Dragon to Heroic Intervention, there are a lot of very famous and expensive dragons that we'll be tossing away here. And this also definitely impacts our mana base. There are no fewer than 8 lands that we've got to swap out of this deck. This is totally okay though. We don't need to have this many expensive cards for this deck to do its thing. Miirym is extraordinarily powerful. Even without all of these big baddies, this deck is still gonna do a bunch of work. We'll first start off by simply swapping in a bunch of more budget-friendly lands to fill out that mana base. And actually, I'm even going to go ahead and add an extra land in here while I'm at it, just to make sure that this deck is still as consistent as it can be. Sometimes the more expensive cards add to the consistency of a deck, so when we have fewer of those expensive cards, I like to make sure that our bases are completely covered. After that, it's important to note that we lost the card Heroic Intervention, which is an amazing protection piece for all of our fantastic flying beasties. Thankfully, since we're in blue, it's pretty easy for us to find a budget version of a protective spell instead. Basically, any type of counterspell would do here. If someone tries to wipe our board, it's really easy for us to just dismiss it out of hand. The card Parallel Lives was also a very pricey cut, but I have another addition here that I think will scratch a similar itch. Are y'all familiar with the new card Irenicus's Vial Duplication? Because it's kind of awesome. Just like our commander, it makes a non-legendary copy of our creatures. No, this isn't a Parallel Lives, but I mean, it is pretty cool to duplicate any of the things that we want to. I think this card's getting way overlooked right now, and this definitely seems like a great home for it if you're playing a lot of legendary creatures in your deck and you don't want to break the bank. Alright, now let's actually look at some of the effects of the dragons that we lost in the budget cutting. A lot of those dragons deal a lot of damage, and that's an effect that we definitely value really, really highly. So to try and make up for that a little bit, I think I want to add in a Warstorm Surge. We're putting a lot of bodies into play, and a lot of really sizable bodies at that. So when our commander is duplicating all of these amazing creatures, getting double the Warstorm Surge triggers seems like a really great way to knock down creatures we don't like and to knock out players that we're going after. And actually, speaking of damage, here's another easy go-to for dragon decks. Crucible of Fire is a really good bump effect. This card's perfectly good in the Dragon, and I think it's probably even better here, where we'll usually have twice as many dragons in play because we're constantly copying all of them. It's not revolutionary or anything like that, but it's certainly going to get the job done, and opponents will not be happy to see you play it. But now it's on to the most important part of a budget cut. Which dragons do we add in to replace the expensive ones that we cut? We lost a lot of very famous and very powerful dragons, so what should we play instead? Luckily, the answers are all very, very fun. Skyline Despot, for example, adds the Monarch to the game and gives us even more dragon tokens. With 2 of them, it's a lot harder to lose the Monarchy, and we'll get twice as many extra 5/5s. Since a lot of the dragons we lost also added in a lot of extra punch, I'm definitely here for the card Terror of Mount Valus as well. Playing this card sometimes means that your opponents just die on the spot. This deck already contains a Tarka World Render, and we're always happy to see that one, and I think Terror of Mount Valus helps fill a similar role. Juvenile Mist Dragon strikes me as a pretty decent dragon for this deck too. When it enters the battlefield, we tap down one creature from each opponent, and they don't untap. And if we have our commander in play, this means that we do that effect twice. That stalls out the two most important creatures for each player, allowing us to basically attack for free for 2 turns. For a card that costs less than a dime and costs only 5 mana, I gotta say, I'm pretty impressed by this one. This is the type of card to absolutely blow out unsuspecting opponents. Oh, and it's also relevant to point out that this deck contains the card Savage Ventmaw, which makes a bunch of mana when we attack. And Savage Ventmaw pretty famously combos up with the card Hellkite Charger. Every time we attack, we get a bunch of mana, and we can use that mana to attack again. If you feel that your deck needs a lot more punch or certainty for its win conditions, this is a pretty easy way to close a game down, no matter what your opponents are up to. However, the most important budget addition, in my opinion, for this deck is a card that will prevent our opponents from ever being able to block our stuff at all. And that's why I really want to throw in a Thunder Maw Hellkite. Every time it attacks, it damages and taps down enemy flyers to make sure that our scaly friends will get in unblocked. Again, this is the type of card that will completely take our opponents by surprise. This card is free damage. This card is dragons done right. And that'll do it for the official swaps for the budget deck, but before we move on, I have one last thing that I want to address. If you're in the mood for a very spicy and very wonky version of a Miirym deck, I gotta say, I've never seen another commander who would love to play a clone tribal deck quite like Miirym. Every time you play a clone, you can copy Miirym. The legend will die, but you'll still get the trigger to make a non-legendary token version of Miirym that will stick around. And then all of those extra copies will help you make exponentially more copies of Miirym. If you want to forgo Dragon Tribal completely and just craft a deck that tries to make as many copies of Miirym as possible, I just think that sounds like a really fun brew. Okay, that'll do it. Here we have the budget version of the Miirym list, and you can find both Miirym deck lists in the description below, with the cuts in the maybe board. Miirym on the wall, who's the best dragon of them all? I hope you've had a fantastic time looking over this amazing new Temur Dragons commander, and if you have any other suggestions that you'd like to make for your fellow Draconic players, make sure you leave them down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.